morning, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the Inter-American Development Bank's flagship report, Development in the Americas, DIA 2025. This year's theme is Markets for Development, Improving Lives Through Competition. To begin, I'm honored to invite the IDB President, Ilan Goldfan, to deliver the welcoming remarks. Mr. President.
So, thank you very much. Good morning. I'm very honored to be able to launch this year Developments in the Americas report, the DIA. This is your work here, and I get to launch, so it's an honor for me. The report is about the markets for development, improving lives through competition. It looks at very fundamental issue, how well markets work, and what does this mean for what we do, which is development. For us, markets are very important, but they need to work correctly. They will need to work fine. And they are very important because they are the engine of development. If you want really to have the private sector leading growth, leading development, and that is very important because if you want firms to invest, if you want firms to innovate, and get jobs, you need also to make markets work. We at IDB are putting the private sector at the center. We already have IDB Invest and IDB Lab that has a quite important role in this institution, IDB Group. IDB Invest and IDB Lab represent around 44% of our financing. We have a capitalization of IDB Invest, which means that we're going to get to parity in not too long. And we're working on enabling conditions so that the private sector can lead growth. We're working on IDB Group. We have a new logo, which means that we just are a group. And that has been a very nice introduction. We have projects together, which are the LAC Crece, which is LAC growth. How can grow together with all of everybody? But we need competition, and sometimes it's limited. Sometimes markets are too concentrated. Sometimes we have barriers to entry. Sometimes firms are small, informal, and workers and consumers bear the cost. So this DIA does what other DIAs do. It brings evidence to the challenge. So let me start with diagnosis. A few numbers that you'll see in the report, and I'm sure that people will present the numbers, but this is just a teaser for you. So, numbers. Markups, which is how much you charge over cost, average 35% in our region, compared to 20%, which means that you have much more of a markups here. So that means that workers have fewer opportunities and weaker bargaining power. So at the end of the day, they take home just 50% of the value they generated compared to 80% in other advanced economies, or 65% if you want to compare to the US. Very important numbers. And we call fragmentation. Markets are fragmented because they are not a market that can work together easily. 95% of firms have fewer than 5 workers. But those small firms absorb the majority of employment. And the most productive firms remain a small share of the economy. And that's the issue with productivity. So I see this more as an opportunity than a problem. We can do better. And I think what the DIA wants to do and what the IDB wants to push is how can we do it better? So numbers again, evidence. If product markets in Latin America and Caribbean were as competitive as those in advanced economies, here's the number. The GDP per capita could be 11% higher and inequality 66% lower. 100% higher GDP, 6% lower inequality. If markets, labor markets in this case, were more dynamic and open, the gains could be even larger. You can get up to 25% higher GDP per capita. So, not theory, actual gains in living conditions. So, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we proposing? First, some examples where it has actually worked. And take, for example, digital payment system. I mean, the first example, they said Brazil and PIX. That makes me look bad, because I was actually involved in the PIX, so I don't want to, maybe we'll put it later. But let me start it in my talking points. It's the first one I have to be. So in Brazil, the brilliant idea of launching the PIX brought fast, low-cost payments to more than 150 million users, many of them previously unbanked. For informal micro enterprises, it opened a new way to businesses. So what did PIX do? It removed fees, so it was free. It has an open infrastructure, which means everybody could use. It made it easier and cheaper for everybody to enter the market. You don't need to be a big bank or a large bank to do it. It will be just a small financial institution. And then you compete. And that's why we are here, why this example is here. Because PIX is about formalization, making consumers bankable. And of course, you want them to be bankable. But this is the entry for formalization. You make them bankable, then everything else becomes formality. But here is that you increase competition. And that was very important for productivity. Loan portability, we have in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, where borrowers refinance and switch lenders more easily, so you can easily change. So all these large spreads will go down because you have more competitions. So where we can offer areas of support. So you know, our reports offer very clear policy recommendations. So it's about an important topic, you look at the evidence, and then you propose policy issues. That's the DIA. And the three of them are reduce market fragmentation by improving infrastructure, having the same rules, which we call harmonization, improving processes which make it easier across borders, so firms can grow and integrate into more large value chains, so they are more integrated. Number two, you design smarter regulation. So it's not about too much regulation, and it's not about not having regulation. It's about smarter regulation, which is the most difficult thing to do, and I think that's the policy issue. Number three, you need agencies to make competition. So competition is there, is the invisible hand, but you need to make the invisible hand work. So you need agencies, and you need the agencies to be strong, because we have learned that institutions are quite important. So institutions make markets work better. What does it mean, institutions in this case? Regulators, capable regulators, competition agencies, for example, independent courts, because bankruptcies and when things don't work correctly, you do need the judicial system to work for them. What else? It is about sustaining and reform over time. How can you sustain reform over time? It's about what I always say here, patience and persistence. You need to be there continuously without stop so that institutions are built, get more competition. So let me just close to say that we are about what we are calling enabling conditions for the private sector. And this report is about enabling conditions for private sector-led development. And that's not a small thing to do. And in this case, the enabling condition is competition that really speaks to development. And as a development bank, we need to support the countries. So we offer them policies, evidence and policies. And as a knowledge bank, this evidence and these policies are making us a knowledge bank that has been recognized externally by many of you. So congratulations. I invite all of you that are listening and learning that this is a wonderful DIA. You should read it. Congratulations to the team. Congratulations to everybody that has worked. And I'm sure our region will really appreciate this DIA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now, I would like to invite two of the editors of the DIA report, Vanessa Alviares and Cesar Santos. Please join us here. They're going to present the main findings of this year's report, Market for Development, Improving Life Through Competition. Cesar, Vanessa?
Hello? Okay. Okay, as this is coming, first, thanks, President Goldfein, for the nice words about our project. Not yet. Okay, I think that. All right. Thanks everyone for coming here. So I'm Cesar Santos from the Research Department of the IDB.
And I'm Vanessa Alviares from the Research Department at the IDB.
We are editors of the DIA together with Matias Busso, also from the Research Department, Phil Kiefer from IFD, and Rodolfo Stucci from BD Invest. Before we jump in, let me just say that this was a IDB group-wide effort. IFD, BD Invest, BD Lab, and many people that contributed to this, external advisors, one of them is here, chapter writers, research assistants, many people to name here. So Vanessa and I are happy to be here to present the main findings of the report. That's us. And the first thing I want to say is that there has been immense progress in Latin America and the Caribbean over the last few decades. We are plotting here two examples out of many possibles that we could have chosen. On the left-hand side, we have average inflation in green, and we can see a steep decline in average inflation in the region over the years. And in blue, a measure of sovereign risk, the MB, that's also been going down. So these are just some examples that macroeconomic stability in the region has improved. If we go more micro on the right-hand side, you see the average years of education in the region, and that increased considerably since the 50s across the board in the region. So these are good news. The problem is that income, however, in Latin America and the Caribbean has not grown as much. So here it's the income per capita in blue for Latin America and the Caribbean, and in green we plot like a comparable region, a synthetic region. And we see that Latin America and the Caribbean increased threefold, but this comparable region eightfold. So we've seen a lot of progress, but yet we are still lagging a little bit on income per capita. And what are the reasons behind this?
Well, one key ingredient of economic development that is very often overlooked is competition. And the reason why competition matters is because it's going to influence how resources are allocated to the best productive use. So without effective competition, it's going to be hard that the gains from economic growth could actually be materialized. And that is the subject of this book, competition. So just let me give you a capsule of the three main messages that we have in the book. First, competition drives economic development. And this is very important because what we find in the report is that market competition is weaker in Latin America and the Caribbean economies than what we found in advanced economies. And third, governments can do much more in order to bring home the benefits from increasing competition. These three messages are built on a set of new results that are grounded on a wealth of microdata that we use here. From household surveys to detailed firm-level microdata. But one of the things that we like to highlight as a group is that we have developed at home here at the IDB a new data set called Compete Lag that is bringing together a set of harmonized indicators that are able to measure both competition and productivity for countries in the region. And we're going to talk more about that later, and many of the results that you're going to see today are actually based on this data set.
So let's start talking about each of these three main messages from the top. So the first one is that competition fuels development. What we're going to show is that competition fosters productivity growth and can reduce inequality in our region. So what's the problem when we don't have competition? The issue is that in markets with low competition, at the end of the day, firms end up influencing prices. And when they can influence the prices of the goods they sell and also of the inputs they hire, and this has wide-ranging effects on the economy for consumers, workers, the economy, all society. For consumers, what that means is that they end up paying higher prices for the goods and services they buy. For workers, what it means is that firms end up paying lower wages and workers end up with lower income. Now, when you sell things at higher prices, you produce less. So for the economy, that means lower productivity. Without the threat of competition, firms have less of an incentive to innovate. And we're talking here about firms that charge higher prices, pay lower wages, so they're very profitable, workers are making lower income. That, in the end of the day, means that the society becomes more unequal. Now let's try to put some numbers to this story. And what we're going to do to quantify these effects of more competition in the region is as follows. What we want to understand is what are the effects that market power have on growth and inequality in economies from our region that are particular, that have certain characteristics. For example, a high degree of informality. And when we try to understand this, we noticed that there was no off-the-shelf framework that we could use to answer this question. So our approach was to develop a novel economic model grounded in the microdata that Vanessa was talking about, and we'll talk about more, for several Latin American and Caribbean countries. And with this new framework, what we want to test is how changes in policies and market structure affect economic outcomes. I'll tell you a little bit of the economic outcomes here. There's more in the book, but here's a thought experiment we're going to conduct. Imagine that we take the markets, the way we observe them in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we just magically make them as competitive as those markets in more advanced economies. What would happen? And I will do that for two markets, but the bottom line is that the lack of competition in the region comes with large economic costs. So the left-hand side shows the exercise I just told you about for product markets. What would happen if product markets in the region were as competitive as those in more advanced economies? We would see that GDP per capita would increase 11%. That was the headline number that President Goldfein was talking about. And inequality would decrease 6%. We can do the exact same analysis for labor markets. What would happen if labor markets were as competitive as those labor markets in more advanced economies? GDP per capita would increase 25%, and we would see a steep decline of 30% on income inequality. The report talks about other effects. More output also comes with more formalization. More formalization, more output also comes with higher fiscal revenues for governments. Now, competition affects other things, including business dynamism, how firms enter, exit the market in the process of creative destruction. And the thing is that competition acts as an engine of creative destruction and economic growth, and it affects firm entry, exit, expansion, and innovation. With more competition, with more entry of firms, these new firms can bring new ideas, new products to the marketplace. And as a natural step of the creative destruction, the less productive firms end up exiting. And that frees up resources like labor and capital for successful firms to expand, creating more jobs and boosting investment. And as I was talking about before, with the threat of competition, firms have more incentive to innovate, bringing new ideas, processes, and products to the marketplace. Talking about innovation, what we see is that firms in the region invest little in innovation, for example, in research and development. The thread that we're counting here is that low competition, without the threat of competition, we have low innovation. With low innovation, we have low productivity growth in the long run. And that's what we see in the data, that firms invest little in research and development. In the European Union, it's about 1% of sales, but in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's just 1/4 of that. And we have recent studies that show this interaction between competition and innovation. For example, competition coming from international trade. And this recent paper shows that a 1 percentage point tariff reduction leads to an increase of 2.6% of the knowledge stock over 8 years in the countries. And these knowledge stocks comes with more citations of the work, coming from larger research teams, and also more patenting.
And I think Cesar convinced us that actually competition matters quite a bit for economic growth. And I think that is one of the things we think that actually markets function well in the region, but the answer is that they don't. What we find in the data is that competition is weaker in the region than what it is in developed economies. But of course, a first order question is how we do measure market power. Measuring competition, it is not an easy task. For that, what our approach is that we do not rely on a single indicator, not even on a small set of them. Our approach is to have a wide range of statistics, going from concentration measures, tracking firm dynamics, assessing firm performance, and also establishing market power at the level of the firm. And for this, we're using several metrics at the firm level, such that value added, sales, how much they spend in capital and intermediate inputs, among others. And to do this, we have to tackle many different challenges with the idea that at the end, we get a full set of harmonized indicators that we can actually compare across countries. One of those indicators that tries to proxy the best for market power and that we use throughout the book, it is markups. And actually, the president gave us a hint about how to calculate them, right? They are the ratio between the prices that the firm charges for producing a given unit of the product and how much it costs for the firm to produce it. So just to fix ideas in a perfect competitive environment, that markup is going to be equals 1 because there is no such a gap. Prices just equal cost. One particular feature of markups that we actually enjoy is the fact that they are defined at the firm level. So we don't need to take a stand of the market in which firms are competing, which often is very hard to observe. And after we just gather all this very high-quality data and do all this job of analyzing them and constructing these indicators, what we find is that products and labor markets are less competitive in the region than they are in advanced economies. So just let me start with the product market. What we're observing is that on average, markets in Latin America and the Caribbean are about 4 times more concentrated than they are in advanced economies. And let me just clarify this. A market for us is a country sector year combination. So what we're showing here is just the average across all of how much concentration this is. If you take competition authorities internationally, what they will say is that if the Herfindahl index is about 1,800 points, then you qualify an industry as super concentrated. And in the region, that number is almost 1,500 points, so well above the threshold. But of course, high concentration doesn't necessarily translate in bad news. You may have an industry with very few players, but they are competing aggressively, pushing just prices down. That's why we're going to calculate also markups, that ratio that we just told, prices over cost. And what we observe in the data is that markups are well above 1 for both, for developed economies as well as for Latin America and the Caribbean. But they are much higher in our case. As the president says, they are about 35%, that gap above cost, whereas for developed markets, that's about 20%. But probably some of you are wondering, that's not excess profits. That's just exactly what the firm needs to actually pay for very important fixed cost. For example, if you want to be more productive, you have to invest in research and development, in brand development, as well as in advertisement and others. That's exactly why we go ahead and we compute excess markups, which is the markups that are above and beyond what is needed to cover those necessary fixed costs. And what we find is the same. Excess markups are much higher in the region than in advanced economies. So the message is consistent, and what we find is that limited competition is translated in higher living costs for consumers in the region. And that same limited competition, what it means for workers is lower wages. So what I'm showing here is how many cents a worker takes home for every dollar that they produce as a value in the firm they work for. And in a perfect competitive environment, that's going to be equals 1. The dollar, the worker should take home the entirety of the dollar they produce for their firm. That number is actually far below 1 even in advanced economies, where workers take only 80 cents per dollar. And in the region, we have a huge heterogeneity to observe, but on average, it's much lower. It's only half of the dollar what they take home. If markets were contestable, what you will have is that you're going to have entering firms that are going to compete badly to actually just attract those workers, and they're going to push wages up. But that process of creative destruction that Cesar was telling you about is not what we observe in the region. When we take markups in the product market, what we see is that they are well above 1, but also they are consistently high across years. And when you look at markdowns in the labor market, it's a similar story. They are well below 1 and also consistently low through the entire time period. But lack of competition doesn't manifest only in product and labor markets. Actually, it takes many other corners of the economy. So let's take a look to that. In manufacturing, markups are high, but they are much higher in services. And not only that, they are also well more dispersed. And they are much higher and dispersed in one of the sectors that we care a lot about, which is information and professional services, because they are an engine of growth for these economies. Part of the reasons that we may be observing high markups in that sector is because they usually sell non-tradable goods, so you don't have the competition pressure coming from foreign markets, but also, they are more subject to local regulations. And I want to highlight 2 key features of services that we all should care about. One is that services represent in the region well above 2/3 of total employment and value added in the economy. But second is that services are an intermediate input that are essential not only in services themselves, but also throughout all the rest of the sectors in the economy. So any inefficiencies or lack of competition in services are going to translate in higher prices everywhere else in the economy, like a domino effect. And that's why we're going to actually pay a close attention and do a zoom in 2 key services in our economies. One of them is banking. Cesar wrote an entire chapter of banking, and I can only have the luxury of showing you 1 slide. So in the region, the total credit over GDP is actually quite low. It's below 40%. If you contrast that with above 80% in advanced economies. And when you see that, we said, well, many structural factors are going on for sure, but part of that is limited competition. Measuring market power in banking sector good luck. That's very difficult, right? Like many products are intangibles and they are very hard to price. That's why we take a look to concentration. And what we find is that on average across countries, if you take the 5 largest banks in those countries, what you have is that the 5 largest account for about 79% of the total assets in those economies. If you contrast that with about 51% in advanced economies. So that high concentration together with high return to assets is what we believe is actually pushing also part of being interest rates going high. And with that, limiting just the access to credits that firms and consumers can have. Another very relevant sector is telecommunications, and for 2 reasons. They are just having access to connectivity is paramount for firms to be productive, but also they mean inclusion for consumers. And what I'm showing you here at this moment is how changes in concentration in telecommunications sectors associate with changes in prices for accessing connectivity services. And this spans over a decade. And you see that higher concentration, you see the countries that are in the upper east side of the graph, higher concentration translating consumers paying more prices for connectivity, and in the other way around, when markets have been deconcentrated, they also pay lower prices for those services.
So what we've been telling you so far is that competition is important for development and it's weak in the region. So the third message of the book is that governments can do more to unlock the benefits coming from competition. And in the report, we delineate 3 main policy recommendations, and we're going to talk about each of them in turn now. The first one deals with the fact that markets in the region tend to be small and fragmented. And the problem with small markets is that just a few firms can have a lot of market share and exert market power. So in order to deal with that, we need market integration, and that requires dismantling both domestic and cross-border barriers, opening up markets for broader competition. And this market integration or fragmentation can come from different reasons like technology, geography, and international trade. Let's talk about technology. Technology can both foster or hinder competition. And here are a few examples. Like some of you remember, not the RAs, I guess, but a few decades ago, when you had like your phone number, your cell phone number, and you wanted to switch carriers, you would lose your number because the number belonged to the carrier. So that increased the costs for consumers to switch providers. But several countries have implemented this number portability that means that consumers can switch carriers and still keep the numbers, lowering the switching costs. More recently, as President Goldfein was saying, we've seen a big change in payment systems in the region, like with the emergence of fast retail payment systems. And remember, it used to be the case that if you want to transfer money from one bank to another, you relied on the technology provided by your bank, but now this technology is more interoperable. We have more examples like, more recent examples like electric vehicle chargers, and there might be some future products that we don't know what they're going to be, but the point here is that we need to make this technology interoperable because that lowers switching costs and leads to a rise in competition.
And another source of market fragmentation that is very important comes from geography, as Cesar was saying before. What we find in the book is that the cost of moving people as well as moving goods is very high in Latin America and the Caribbean relative to other markets. So what that means for workers is that when a worker tries to switch jobs, they find that that's very costly and difficult. And just for you to have a sense of how costly it is, it's about 5 times the average annual wage of a worker in the region. And actually that's much higher if switching jobs also entails to moving to another region, for example. And that matters because when you have such a high cost of switching, labor mobility is going to be lower. And that's going to mean that just employers are going to have better ways, let's say, to set prices in wages. But not only that, they could set the entire conditions of the job. What that means for goods is that transportation costs, when we measure them at valoring freight rates, are much higher in the region than in developed economies. And for both, this is for imports and for exports. So what that means is that firms are going to have a harder time to access new markets, to sell more goods, to access more clients. But also, it's going to be more difficult for them to source cheaper intermediate inputs that then they can use in their production process to lower their overall cost. Very recent and compelling evidence is showing us that increasing geographical integration has huge economic payoffs. And that evidence is coming from the expansion of the subway system in Mexico City. What they find is that they see an important decline in informality in all these areas that are near to the subway stations. And the reason is because now you have workers that can connect with more firms, with more formal firms, and also with firms that pay higher wages. Those reallocations of workers from informal firms to formal firms is so powerful that they boost allocative efficiency enough to increase gains from welfare from 15 to 20%. And another source of fragmentation is international trade. In the report, we find new evidence for countries in our region. And what we see is that when you have higher competition across borders, actually the prices that consumers pay are going to be lower. In the region, it's very particular because what we see is that most of the gains that you get from trade liberalization is actually passed on to consumers. And we also find that when you have more import competition, the markups of domestic firms are actually pushed down. And that significant decline in markups that you see at the left-hand side of this figure is actually more pronounced among firms that, to begin with, they start with high markups. That tells you a little bit of like this pressure force that trade could have on dominant firms in a market, just creating more competition. So what we need is competition policy that requires connecting markets through technology, creating systems that are more interoperable, lowering switching costs among consumers and firms, also through infrastructure, just creating the networks to connect cities, regions, and countries, regional integration by connecting firms and consumers across different countries in Latin America, effectively enlarging the markets that they can access to.
Which brings us to the second policy recommendation of the report that aims to deal with the barriers that we document exist in Latin America and the Caribbean, firm growth and entry. And regulation can create some of these barriers, so it's important that regulation is designed to minimize anti-competitive effects while dealing with important problems that regulations aim to address. So regulations, as most anything economists study, come with benefits and costs. And the important thing is for regulators to balance these trade-offs. So let's think about some of the benefits of regulation. So regulations can solve market failures, things that can come from asymmetric information like workplace safety or drug efficacy. Regulations can also be used to deal with negative externalities like pollution. Regulations can also be used for redistribution policies that shift the allocation of rents between workers and firms, consumers and producers, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the benefits of regulations. But it's important that regulatory institutions should weigh these social benefits with the cost of regulations, because regulation can sometimes prevent firm entry, slow firm growth, and impose excessively high costs on firms. When we look at barriers to entry, we see that regulations in the region lead to high barriers to entry. Here are some examples of barriers to entry coming from regulation, things like professional requirements that some workers to work in certain occupations need to have some types of certification, or zoning that regulates the construction inside a city, or capital requirements for banks. These are all examples of regulations that have desirable effects, but they might impose barriers to entry. And what we see is that when we look at the countries in the region, that the barriers to entry are much higher than in OECD countries. And recent study has shown that firm entry has direct effects on for consumers. So this recent study shows that for the Dominican Republic, shows that allowing more stores to enter the market leads to increased local competition, lowered consumer prices, and improved service quality. Now, there are other types of regulations that are different for firms of different sizes. We call these the size-dependent policies. And if these policies are some of these policies can give incentives for firms to remain small, perhaps inadvertently. For example, there might be some special tax regimes for small firms in the countries, and here we have like many other examples. Again, there might be clear benefits of some of these policies, but at the same time, these size-dependent policies may incentivize firms to remain small such that they can take advantage of these types of regulations. And then what we see in the data for the region is a lot of small firms. So what this graph shows is the percentage of the labor force that is employed in firms of different sizes. We see that more than 50% of the labor force is employed in firms of at most 5 workers, so small firms. What we seem to be missing is these medium-sized firms, which the literature calls the missing middle. And these medium-sized firms are the ones that are in a prime position to grow and contest the markets against the larger incumbents, but we don't see that in the region, and that's particular of the region. In developed economies, we don't see such a steep missing middle. The other thing that we were talking about a few slides ago is that the regulatory cost in the region is high, both in manufacturing and services. For example, we see that the time managers spend dealing with regulation in the region is higher than OECD countries. And given the regulatory cost, perhaps not surprisingly, firms in the region engage more frequently in informal payments. And we have a recent study showing the price effects of competition restricting regulation, that these regulatory barriers to entry leads to lower competition and high prices, and removing and simplifying these restrictive regulations leads to increased entry and, at the end of the day, lower consumer prices.
And Cesar laid out quite clearly the benefits and the cost of those regulations. So the question is how we can balance those trade-offs. In other words, how we can design pro-competitive regulations. And we believe this starts by regulators answering the following 3 questions. First, identify what the problem is and how costly it is. In particular, how much it harms competition to begin with. Second, identify the market failure that is behind the problem, in particular because if you don't find any and you act through regulation, you're going to just do more harm than benefits. And third, you have to choose and to identify what are the policy or combination of policies that can more efficiently correct those market failures. To answer these 3 questions, we think we need to build institutions that can or are capable of actually conducting what we call regulatory impact assessments. And those assessments are basically what puts in white and black what are the benefits and the cost of the proposed regulation. In a survey that was conducted in 2021, out of 11 countries in the region, only 3 of them were conducting regulatory impact assessment. Less than half of them were requiring actually to have public consultations before they hand in the final draft of the regulation. And only 1 have a centralized agency that actually could coordinate and supervise all the regulatory activities. So one thing that we propose in the book is that competition agencies are the ideal focal points in order to conduct these regulatory impact assessments that are quite important for 3 reasons. 1, they have the expertise and the capacity. Second, they are neutral. They can oversee the overall economy and not only one sector. And also they have federal jurisdiction. But good regulation, a smart regulation as we like to call it, it's not enough to have economic safeguards that we just mentioned. We really need political safeguards. So too often you have special interest groups or lobbyists just trying to get past regulation that just protect their own interest. And that just creates insider privileges. So what happens is that when you have this non-transparent, pretty opaque policy making, then what you have is regulations that are protecting incumbents and preventing entry. And that's just going to create reforms that are very short-lived. So if we want to create very pro-competitive reforms that are long-lasting, we need transparency, we need accountability, and also we need government oversight.
And this brings us to the 3rd main policy recommendation, which is talking about these competition agencies that Vanessa was just mentioning. Because these competition agents, we document in the book that there's several instances of anti-competitive behavior by firms, and these competition agencies are the ones that are at the front lines dealing with this anti-competitive behavior. So it's important that antitrust institutions are strengthened and their legal capacity to act increased. So let's talk a little bit about antitrust. So when we talk about it, it's important to talk about the problem, the status quo of competition agencies in the region, and also point towards solutions. So starting with the problem, what is the problem? Well, firms may engage in anti-competitive behavior. And this type of behavior takes many shapes and forms. One is cartels and collusions that firms get together to act as a unit in order to exert more market power. We have several examples in the book and also policies that aim to deal with that. One example is public procurement in Mexico, that they implemented more competition-friendly auction guidelines, and they used that in the purchase of insulin medication that led to lower prices, more quantity of medication purchased, and at the end of the day, better health outcomes for the population. We also have cases of abuse of dominance in which firms take their dominant position in a sector to exert market power, or mergers and acquisition when firms merge to get bigger market share, or another firm acquires a smaller firm again to get bigger market share. So different types of anti-competitive behavior. So we need antitrust agencies to deal with that. So what is the status? By looking at the status quo of these competition agencies in the region, what we find is that more resources are needed. The left-hand side graph shows the average budget of antitrust agencies in the region relative to OECD counterparts. So it's much lower. In the middle graph, you can see that the size of the competition staff in these agencies is also much lower than in developed economies. And then, perhaps not surprisingly, these local competition agencies end up being less productive than OECD decisions per staff of about half of those in the OECD.
And in these cases, just having resources is not enough. We also need more autonomy, stronger legal autonomy for our competition agencies. So autonomy takes about three components that we should take a look at. One is how independent you are from the executive power. We need competition agencies that can act, far away from political pressures. Second is how you choose the leadership of those competition agencies. So that should be through a competitive process that will enhance independence. But also, for example, could be that it needs to pass Congress approval. That will be another form. Finally, is who has the final word. So we think competition agencies should have the final decision and also bring with it the penalties, that goes with the decisions they make. What we see in that graph is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the region regarding the legal independence of the competition agencies we have, and we think there is plenty of room, for countries share their experiences and learning from them. Let me show you one case from many when antitrust authorities actually can make a difference. In our own study, we find that the stricter merger regulations actually land reductions in prices for consumers of beverage products. And what we find is that if governments in Latin America will have emulate those merger remedies that European competition authorities and US apply, then our Latin American consumers will have paid 30% less in prices for those beverage products.
So we've been talking quite a bit about competition agencies and their importance. So at this point, I think when we think about how to modernize them and strengthen them, it's good to have a comparison with central banks in the region. If we go back to the very first slide of this presentation, we showed the steep decline in average inflation in Latin America over the last few decades. And a good part of that was due to central banks acting in an independent fashion with human capital and access to data, etc. And we think that this is a nice blueprint for competition agencies to emulate. They need independence and human capital capacity such that they can make autonomous, insulated decisions. But they deal with all kinds of cases, and it's important that they're able to hire specialists on demand for particularly complex cases. That they also have access to levers, policy levers, modern leniency and punishment tools to fight cartels and other types of anti-competitive behavior. And just like central banks have this wealth of data that they use to conduct their day-to-day operations, it's important that competition agencies also have access to administrative data, firm-level data, such that they can understand the sectors that they're dealing with to make better decisions. So data is key.
And that's true. We're data lovers, actually. So data is not only the starting point, it's what gets you to the finish line. And measuring competition is extremely important, and we have to do it well. You know what I said, if you don't measure, you cannot fix it. So that's why we have created a new data set that is called CompetLAC. This is the region's first open access platform that has a set of comparable indicators on competition and market dynamics. How we did it? Well, what we did is that we just create in-house a common methodological framework that was capable of adapting to the different realities of the data sets that we have in the region. And we were able to deliver this comparable set of indicators that were policy relevant to make decisions. And what is that we have? We have hundreds of harmonized indicators spanning across 5 different dimensions: concentration, firm dynamics, firm performance, market power, and also descriptive statistics of all the variables that go in the calculation of those indicators I mentioned before. The data coverage so far that we have is for 8 countries. This was an effort that was possible because we partnered with top researchers in the region, that they have both the access to the data and the expertise on the data to help us to apply our methodological framework to their settings. And we really have the hope that many other countries in the region enjoy this effort. And CompetLAC has 3 main goals. One is supporting IDB operations, of course, also fostering the regional debate and promoting policy dialogue. And we hope that, having more countries in that will really help to that. And CompetLAC is available today for all of you to access.
Free of charge. It is a pretty cool website, but this is getting long, so we should probably wrap up. So
we should. So just main takeaways. Competition drives development and is weaker in lack. But the good news is that governments can do much more to help us to get where we need. They can reduce market fragmentation, implement better regulation, and strengthen antitrust authorities.
No one could have said it better. And the last thing to say is that here are the QR codes that you can scan to access CompetLAC. As Vanessa was saying, it's available right now. I can see some phones. It works beautifully on your phones. And you can browse and download the data, and also the publication, which is available right now freely in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa and Cesar, for those insightful highlights. For now, we're going to go with our keynote speaker. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Sean Ennis. He's a professor at Norwich Business School at the University of East Anglia and director of its Center for Competition Policy for Competition Policy. Earlier in his career, Professor Ennis worked at the European Commission's Directorate General for Competition. This is quite complicated. I hope I didn't mess it up that much. And also worked at the U.S. Department of Justice Antitrust Division, also at the OECD, and as an executive of my research. Professor Ennis, I'll invite you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I guess I'll start by saying buenos dias, bom dia, and good morning. It's a delight to be commenting on this new landmark report, Markets for Development. While my colleagues have discussed the report's specific findings and recommendations, my task, I think, today is to situate this work within a broader economic, development and macroeconomic literature. And to explain why this report is actually arriving at a really critical moment for Latin America and the Caribbean, and I would suggest for development policy worldwide. It's what we've been witnessing recently is a global convergence around competition policy. This goes across continents and political systems. Policymakers are rediscovering that how markets function and whether they remain contestable fundamentally shapes economic prosperity, innovation, and equity. As one example, in Europe, the Draghi report was released in 2024, and it warned that the European risks falling behind in competitiveness, innovation, and growth, and calls for smarter regulatory frameworks that preserve competition while also supporting strategic industries. And in the United Kingdom, the government has explicitly instructed its competition authority and other regulators to stimulate growth. And that's not by abandoning regulation, but by probably rethinking how it's designed to ensure markets are working for consumers, workers, and innovative firms. In the United States, there have been some new executive orders issued earlier this year that have directed federal agencies to review all regulations that impose undue burdens on small business and that might impede private enterprise and entrepreneurship. And these initiatives reflect a growing recognition that regulatory accumulation over decades may have inadvertently created barriers to entry, reduced competition, and slowed productivity growth. So why this renewed attention to competition policy now? The answer lies in a kind of uncomfortable truth that has emerged from decades of economic research, which is that despite progress on many fronts, Latin America have struggled to translate these into sustained productivity growth and rising living standards, very importantly. This challenge is particularly acute in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the progress that has been made since the 1950s is really remarkable in many, many respects. Yet the GDP per capita growth, as was mentioned, is lagging, has lagged what one could consider to be comparable regions, and this is a productivity puzzle. When we look at that in greater detail, I think it may be that answers we've focused on traditionally might not provide the full solution. They haven't provided the full solution, and we need to look in other areas, other ways. And one of those ways could be through focusing on competitive constraints. And I think that's the real value report. It is talking about how the lack of competition can manifest itself in lower productivity, reduced innovation, persistent informality, and weak business dynamism. Now, I personally have spent several years working with the government of Mauritius, which is a small developing country, and I've worked in at least 8 Latin American economies over the years. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about some of these problems myself. And I would suggest there have been gaps in the academic literature about how competition policy might be tailored to developing and small economies. And this book is helping to fill those gaps. So congratulations to everyone who's been working on this. Many competition policy frameworks have been designed with large advanced economies in mind. I don't necessarily think simply transfer approaches that have been used in one place to another one. So let me situate the IDB report and its central contribution within the macro development literature. I think that's really where it lies. And this report demonstrates that weak competition is not a peripheral concern. It is a first-order constraint on development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And research has established that market power reduces aggregate productivity through multiple channels that are reinforcing. And when firms face insufficient competitive pressures, resources become misallocated. They remain trapped in less productive firms rather than flowing to more efficient ones. And incentives to innovate weaken when incumbents are shielded from rivals. Barriers to entry and expansion prevent that Schepterian process, which is so difficult and potentially painful but important of creative destruction, because that's in part what drives productivity growth. Maybe I just mention that the World Bank also has documented deteriorating market competition in developing economies and linked competition directly to productivity and job creation. And also, this is not just a realization of development economics researchers, it's also on the non-academic front. There's a very nice book that was prepared by the McKinsey research arm, and that performed a comparative analysis of developed economies to each other and looked at why there was slow growth in some of those. And it also identified regulation that was restricting competition as one of the primary constraints on growth in developing economies, and productivity improvements were considered to be a way forwards that was being held back by regulation. So there's nearly 50 years of evidence now from OECD product market reforms that confirms using anti-competitive regulation directly boosts firm entry, can increase innovation, can help to allocate them, and enhance productivity. And the European Commission's analysis of 25 years of competition policy evolution in the EU reaches some similar conclusions in a report that was released just recently, and on which I had the pleasure to work. The IDB report itself is a tour de force. It does something that no other report I know of has done, which is really bringing together a very coherent and ambitious look at competition that might have been identified academically, and to do so systematically with data is relevant to policymaking in Latin America and the Caribbean. I just am very impressed by the final result. The important points to take away, I'll mention them again because I think it's important to say some things 3 times in order for them to hit our memories, and that is that per capita GDP could be approximately 11% higher. Quality might be 6% lower with better competitive conditions in Latin America. These are non-trivial numbers, and for example, that 11% increase in GDP might be equivalent to 5 to 7 years of economic growth at recent rates. That's a lot. The competition can deliver a double benefit because it increases the size of the economic pie, but can also help to improve the distribution across that pie. And that brings me to some research that I've done with colleagues that was about inequality and market power, which showed this relationship exists across developed economies, and quantifies that and finds that as much as 20% or more of wealth in some of the developed countries may be associated with restrictions on competition. And that's because market power is generating 2 effects. It's generating an increased level of profits that flow to business owners. It's also generating higher prices for users. And it's that combination of effects that can lead to wealth impacts and income impacts that are important. So in terms of the analytical architecture of this report, what makes it particularly valuable is bringing together so many different pillars into a single study, and to be creating this compete lac data set. That's going to be a gold mine for researchers in the future. So I hope that many people will use that. And I even hope that it might be possible to expand the number of countries covered by it over time. That would be fantastic. It's really a major contribution beyond this report itself that should be kept in mind. In terms of the report's outcomes or findings, it's really providing a microeconomic foundation for why macroeconomic development is going to work well, and ways to make it work well. And so it deals with many of these topics that we've been talking about in development for years, such as informality. Also mentions the importance of size-dependent regulations. This missing middle is really not to be ignored. It's a good takeaway from today. And the models that have been developed for this report allow the simulation of counterfactual scenarios in a really good way. So that's another important contribution here. Finally, it's drawing on microeconomic case studies of sectors to some extent, and randomized experiments even in ways that are really very nice. And it's using a combination of methods, which ensures, to my mind, that its results are more solid and stable. So just in terms of some other findings, I think a 35% markup is quite high compared to 20% that we might find in other places. Just do the math, that's a lot more than a 50% level higher than other countries, and it may be good for businesses in some respects to have high margins. I'm not suggesting that margins should be zero, but it is a point to keep in mind that these are unusually high margins. This evidence on pricing that's been presented really complements the work that I've done with solvent inequity. So there was a slide about that, but just now. But maybe the important point is that we've reviewed all the studies we could find on competition and regulation and pro-competitive changes in regulation, and found that there is overall something like a 19% price reduction from getting rid of anti-competitive regulations. So that can be quite a substantial improvement in living standards when you look at different products. So now we've got the solutions that have been suggested by the report. I just would endorse those fully as the way forward. I was speaking in the French Senate last week and really emphasized the fact that one size fits all is not the right way to go for thinking about competition in the economies we were talking about there. And so tailored strategies are really needed. And so this report is acknowledging the heterogeneity, and I think is an important step along that process of identifying the next steps forwards. So what are some of these priorities? I'm just going to endorse those that have been mentioned and focus on one, which is that it really is possible to develop a mechanism that identifies regulations that unduly restrict competition and makes real efforts to revise them. I've worked in at least 4 different countries where we've done that on a concrete level. We've reviewed thousands of regulations. We've made many hundreds of regulatory recommendations. Just as one example, in Greece at one moment, the Minister of Economy passed a law that made more than 400 regulatory as a result of some of these reviews. So it is possible for such improvements to occur, and it doesn't require high science either, to be honest. It just requires good old-fashioned hard labor with a clear sense of what the regulations are that are in place. Not all regulations are always written down on the books, findable on the internet. I would just note, certainly in Greece, we found that sometimes we had to get regulations out of desks of regulators. That was the only way to really know what they were, because there were some customized ones that weren't available any other way. And so there's this process of discovery that's very important, but can lead, I think, to substantial macroeconomic improvements. So when competition affects GDP growth rates by double digits and inequality could be improved by substantial margins, then I think we've got a matter that's not a technical one for specialists. This is for finance ministers, central bankers, and government politicians, development planners to really integrate into their frameworks. And I think the big question for me right now is how to translate these insights into a sustained process of reform. I think I would just hope that you might think about some various ways of developing a process by which you can support Latin American and Caribbean countries in helping them in a customized way to improve their fundamental market conditions and help to drive some of the benefits that are real potential outcomes from greater competition and greater market operation. So I think the evidence is clear, the tools are available, and the time to act is not tomorrow, it's now. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ennis. Now we'll continue with our panel conversation. The panel will be moderated by Laura Alfaro, IDB Chief Economist and Economic Counselor. Joining her, Anabel Gonzalez is the Vice President for Countries and Regional Integration at the IDB. Alessandro Maffioli is the Managing Director for Development and Effectiveness at the IDB Invest. And Emilio Pineda, Sector Manager for Institutions for Development at the IDB. Please, you can turn on your microphones and Laura.
Good morning, I'm Laura Alfaro. I'm Chief Economist and Economic Counselor. Let me first thank Professor Ennis for your very kind words. I agree with you. I think this is a major contribution not only to policy making, but I also think to, in general, our economic knowledge. And it also gives us a roadmap in how to act to help the region improve. I also appreciated the fact that, as you mentioned, this is an issue that if we tackle, not only can we increase GDP, but also we can increase the distribution of income in the region. So let me now, I have the pleasure to be joined by a distinguished group of people bringing together operational, analytical, and policy perspectives. This is also an important opportunity for the IDB to reflect on its role in strengthening the competition agenda in the region. Let me start by introducing Anabel Gonzalez. Just realized that we're going to get a little bit into our heads in the back, but that is fine. Anabel is the Vice President for Countries and Regional Integration at IDB. She was also, previously she served as Deputy Director General at the WTO, and she was also Minister of Trade in Costa Rica. I have heard that possibly that was the best cabinet in the history of mankind. I'll get back to you on the reference for that. She brings deep expertise in how international trade and economic integration can boost regional development. But as President Ilan mentioned, IDB, we believe that development has to happen through the private sector, and thus we have here Alessandro Maffioli. He is Managing Director of Development Effectiveness at IDB Invest. During his extensive experience at the IDB Group, Alessandro has combined applied research and policy work to analyze the impact of sectorial measures and fair dynamism on economic performance. Alessandro offers a perspective on how competition policy translates into measurable impacts on firms, productivity, and as I said, most importantly, private sector outcomes. And Emilio Pineda, he is the manager of Institutions for Development. So this is your sector. These questions are about your sector. As Ilan mentioned, markets need functioning institutions, and this is why we're here. Emilio was previously economist at IMF Western Head, the Ministry of Finance in Mexico, focusing on how coordination across different levels of government and their management can have better outcomes. He brings deep expertise, institutional design, and reform. Let me start then with Emilio. As I mentioned, this is about institutions and markets for development. The book argues and shows that the region is characterized by a regulatory framework that disincentivizes firm entry and growth. So do you think the region needs a significant regulatory reform to address competition challenges? And what would be the initial steps? As Professor Chan mentions, we do need to start thinking of the roadmap, how to go ahead. And so what would be that policymakers should consider in the region when it comes to improve the regulatory framework?
Thank you, Laura. Let me start by thanking you and congratulating you and all the authors for a really excellent book, a really excellent investigation. So the answer to your question is yes, we have a regulatory problem and we need to address that. And the DIA makes a really wonderful job in making a systematic case of what are the problems that we have and what are the dimensioning of those problems. And the core issue is that most regulations in the region are enacted without any systematic analysis, ex-ante analysis of the potential benefits and costs of each regulation. So meaning that the broader impact of the regulations on the households, on market competition and market dynamics essentially goes ignored. Therefore, as a result, it's frequently the case that regulations sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, protect entrenched incumbents, limit new entrants, and undermine the consumer welfare. So yes, we have an issue and we need to address that. And I think the DIA offers an excellent roadmap for solutions to address these problems. And I would like to elaborate on three areas that I think are fully aligned with the DIA recommendations. So first, we really need institutional design for better governance on regulation. Countries in the region need to establish governance arrangements that require ex-ante analysis of regulations in all cases. This means, in basic English, that before any agency is empowered to regulate, there should be a clear mandate to assess how the proposed rules will affect productivity, competition, and consumer welfare. And a very good example of this is Chile's National Evaluation and Productivity Commission, which systematically reviews regulatory distortions in strategic sectors. And it's not surprised that in your presentation, when you show the different countries in the region, Chile is by far the one that is best situated pretty much at OECD level. The second is we need to strengthen the capabilities of the regulators, and this means having tools that enable their ability to make evidence-based decisions before making the regulations. The professor was making a very interesting case on how difficult it is to assess the regulations that are only based on paper. No, it takes a long time. It's a very difficult job. So in this sense, the digitalization and the use of tools like artificial intelligence can really be a super useful tool to have a more expedited review process. And there are very good examples of that. For example, Portugal has an AI tool that we're already working to implement in the region. But also we need to enhance the capabilities of the regulators. Regulators they need to have a professionalized civil servants that can have a sound judgment and integrate evidence into regulatory decisions. And a third comment that I would like to make is that we need to leverage those agencies that are already consolidated across the region and maybe a low-hanging apple to start making this regulatory process. And I have two in mind in particular. First, procurement agencies. You mentioned the case in Mexico on how enhancing competitiveness in procurement process can have a very strong impact. There are a lot of procurement agencies in the region that have ample opportunities to reduce pollution and increase competition. And the second one is the financial regulators. They can updating rules, for example, with digital payments, can lower barriers to entry and innovate firms. And let me make a quick comment on how we're already supporting countries in the region and how I envision that this excellent book will allow us to enhance our dialogue with authorities. Let me offer two examples. Under the umbrella of a PBL in Argentina, we supported the government in targeting the elimination of regulations that exempted state-owned enterprises, SOEs, from competition in key sectors such as insurance, air transport, public works, and salary payments. In additional case, in Brazil, also under the umbrella of a PBL, we designed an AI-based regulatory cost calculator inspired in the one used by Portugal, which has been used in the oil and telecommunications sectors. So these are concrete examples of how, with our instruments, we're already helping countries in the region. But I would like to finish by mentioning that the book is definitely going to be an extremely useful tool for us to have a deeper dialogue with authorities and to make a sounder case for reforms with all the tools necessary. The evidence that you show is really, really strategically relevant for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so we see the path and how we can help governments and institutions and policymakers improve competition, but we also need to help create this revolution in the private sector. So, Alessandro, the book does show that the competition is weaker in our region compared to advanced economies. I think there's, as Professor Shan mentioned, I think one of the grand strengths of this book is that it does give you the same idea from different data, different methods. It's extremely robust, this conclusion. So based on your ample experience in the private sector in the region, where do you see, let's not use the word bottlenecks, let's use the word opportunities in terms of improving competition, whether it's in finance, infrastructure, regulation, or firm capabilities? And also, what role can IDB Invest play in converting these challenges, opportunities into a more dynamic business environment?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, and again, congratulations on the book. Is very much welcome from the IDB Invest. I think every single chapter page of this book is relevant for us, so it's going to be a book we're going to read a lot of time, reread and use a lot, and the data as well is going to be very useful for guiding our operational decision. So, as you can imagine, this is really central for us. And to your question, I think that the easy answer would be, as a bit as in the book, all of the above. I mean, there are so many constraints that are affecting the private sector, and they're all true. So everything that is being highlighted in the book, we can see from our experience. I would say that certainly the focus on the industry that have more connection within the economies, so for instance, the financial sector, is the right one. I mean, if we don't have a competitive, innovative financial sector that's able to provide the right financing, a competitive level, and with the level of innovation necessary to the real sector, we're not going to go anywhere soon. In particular, I think that I mean, go back to that, this issue of the missing middle is very much related to that. I mean, how the financial sector is able to support the growth of this high potential growth company. And that is a little bit the holy grail of what we're trying to achieve also in the region. Market integration, the professor was saying that this is good to have a framework for smaller economy, but for sure there are very fragmented economy and disconnected among them. I think this is a big disadvantage for the region that we can see. So it's difficult to work when you have this smaller economy, and within the economy also lack of connection between market and the industry. So that is for sure something that we see in our clients and being a problem to compete internally and compete internationally. So that is also, you miss the pressure of the internal competition, but you also miss the pressure of being exposed to international competition, because it's hard, as Christian has been documented for many years. It's very hard to overcome certain barriers that will allow you to enter in those markets. And labor markets as well, I think that is related to, I mean, the book showed this very well. Whenever you don't have a dynamic financial sector and productive sector that create opportunities, create competitive pressure to compete for talented people, not only creating new jobs. I think this is also why we are going towards not only the number of jobs that have been created, but also the quality of the jobs, what is the impact on wages and productivity, because it's very important to have in mind that we want to create that healthy competition. So what do we do at IDB Invest? I think that many things, but I think that we try to tackle, first I would say the part of innovation and demonstration effect. For us, is a criteria where we look at when we invest in corporate company. One guiding criteria is that we supporting some innovation in terms of the product, the process, what they're doing is, and specifically and explicitly, we ask ourselves the question not what are the effects behind the adopter of this technology. And one of the elements we always consider, would this create competitive pressure in this market to adopt this kind of, it could be a new production process, could be a new way of serving clients for banks, for instance, women-led MSMEs. I mean, there's a lot of product innovation and process innovation, retraining people that needs to be done, and that is a market available, so you can open that market, create competition there. That for sure is going to be important. So we focus a lot on that. Also, in terms of the bigger investments, so really when we see the private sector starting to get an interest into creating almost new industry, you see there's an intersection between complementary investment needs to happen, and there we want to be. An example, when we see in Paraguay that is this interest to create a manufacturing sector based on production of paper, is a huge investment. It requires logistic investments, it requires business park facilities. Is driven by the private sector, so there's no subsidy there, so it's legit, and that will create not only opportunity to get new jobs, but also again competitive pressure on the labor market for highly skilled people now working maybe in the agribusiness to move towards the manufacturing sector and gain new skills and again create those disadvantage. We try to also to tackle directly the thing to reduce barrier. Of course, we work in sectors like telecom, energy, and transport to reduce market fragmentation, provide these services more efficiently. A big focus, as I mentioned, is how do we get, and this is why we really want to work with our banks, how do we get to this mid-size company that has the potential to grow? That I think is really the holy grail. And totally agree that unfortunately, we all love MSMEs, but a lot of the policy design that's been around SMEs is good, can create perverse incentive, where maybe there is that the lack of incentive to grow. And finally, I would, of course, highlight then as a group, then what you can get from the private sector is also the input necessary to say what could be smart regulation that increase competition. With a grain of salt, of course. Private sector, they like competition. So they are both the actors that benefit from that, from the reform that will create a more competitive advantage for who is productive, innovative, whatever, but it's also the part that will say, well, yeah, some protection here would be good for me. So that way we need to work together. We keep an eye also on what not to do. For instance, in terms of data, we've been using a lot the Agri-Monitor data that estimate the cost and consumer surplus from tariff to say, okay, this sector has this distortion. So if we want to invest into that, if big if, then we will really try to focus on productivity enhancement investment. To say, okay, this we can get out of here. We understand that maybe some production were introduced with maybe good intention, and we understand also maybe taking away that suddenly could be disruptive, but then we say, well, if we're going to invest in this, really needs to be focused on productivity and export oriented, so how we get out of inefficient situation. So this is why we look forward to use more data about this, the status, the competitive status of the market, so we can have a better idea also what to do, what not to do, and the type of investment if we step into a market in an industry that we want to pursue. Stop here.
Thank you very much. And we start seeing the themes. Yes, we love data because we want to do evidence-based policy, and for that we need evidence. And so this beautiful data set is going to help you with a lot of these initiatives. As it was mentioned, is very detailed, is sectorial, is at the sector country level, and so we can start using that. But also other themes, there is an ecosystem that we need to tackle. It is the infrastructure, it's the physical infrastructure, it's also the IT. Again, all of these we need to consider, but also the role of services. It was not random that finance was the first example. It was not just because President Ilan played a role. It's because it does play a key role in the development of the region, and we do have very positive evidence of the things we can do with this push for competition through digital payments. But you also mentioned integration, and as we all know, Annabelle is a world expert on themes of integration, and the region does need deeper integration. Markets do remain fragmented, and intra-regional trade is limited. So from your perspective, what domestic and cross-border barriers most limit competitive pressures in the region and also innovation? What reforms would most effectively create larger contestable regional markets, allow firms to scale and innovate, and more importantly, what we IDB can do to help?
Thank you very much, Laura, and let me start by congratulating you, the editors, the authors, on a report that is substantive, it's relevant, and it's timely. And if you allow me to digress just for a moment, I have to say that this is a topic that is very close to my heart. One of the things that I've done in a previous life was be part of an initiative to open the monopoly on telecommunications in my home country, Costa Rica, something that was very, very difficult to do. This monopoly was a major drag on productivity, on innovation, on foreign direct investment, and a nightmare for consumers. And after a very significant effort that included the first and only referendum in the country's history, the monopoly private firms entered the market, and the results have been fantastic in terms of price reduction, services, business dynamism, etc. So one important question, I think, and this is why I think the report is so relevant, is if the results of competition are so beneficial, why is it that policymakers are pursuing competition as the most important driver for growth and inequality reduction, right? And I think part of the answer to that is lack of evidence and lack of analysis. So this brings me to say, this is why I think this report is so important, because it can provide policymakers with the evidence that is required, and of course it can be followed by our capacity to bring operations to support policy reforms in countries, and I'll come back to that. So coming back, I'm sorry for the digression, but I always need to mention this example because I really feel very strongly about it. So you were saying, Laura, that Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the least integrated regions in the world, and this limited integration constrains the region's competitiveness. And the report highlights it. Intra-regional integration, intra-regional trade in our region represents 15% of the region's total trade, far less than what it does in Europe or in Asia. The region also lacks, in particular, participation in global value chains, and we know from evidence that participation in regional and global value chains increases productivity and export performance. So there's a lot of untapped opportunity for countries in order to further integrate. But there are a number of constraints or opportunities, as Laura may call them. And I'm just going to focus in three briefly in the interest of time. So the first is that trade cost in Latin America and the Caribbean remains across the highest in the world, driven by things like weak logistics performance, slow and uneven customs procedures, and high transport and shipping costs. For example, clearing exports can take fewer than 5 days, for example, in Guatemala or El Salvador, but it can take up to 10 days in Brazil, Guyana, and Suriname. We also know that transport costs for LAC imports are about 10% higher than in OECD countries. And this is also explained by factors such as limited competition among shipping companies that basically allows a few firms to set prices. So reforms that focus on trade facilitation and modern logistics are very important to create more contestable competitive regional markets. So that's one opportunity. The second one is that the region's fragmented regulatory regimes weaken competitive pressures and raise trade costs. And we know that we now cover about 50% of import value in the region. And because these measures differ across countries and lack mutual recognition, what happens is that firms must undergo multiple tests, adapt products, and navigate duplicative procedures that are a big burden, particularly for smaller firms and new entrants. But the challenge goes beyond non-tariff measures. It's regulatory fragmentation that affects logistics, digital markets, and infrastructure integration. Countries apply incompatible transport regulations, customs procedures, infrastructure standards, and sector-specific norms that end up increasing cost, reducing predictability for investors, and limiting interoperability. So here, an agenda of regulatory convergence, including mutual recognition of standards, coordinated procedures, and interoperable digital rules is essential, again, to reduce costs and to foster competition and enable regional value chains to operate as part of a single contestable economic space. And the third opportunity/constraint that I want to mention is in the digital world. And this is important because the barriers that matter most for the digital economy are not tariffs, but are borders. And here I want to say that digital trade is really becoming a central driver of growth and innovation, and Latin America and the Caribbean's performance shows its potential. Digitally delivered services have grown fivefold since 2005, and they represent over a third of services exports in the region, with countries like Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica, Mexico, and others leading the way. So this is a fantastic opportunity for the region. To promoting digital trade and investment stem from fragmented restrictive rules in services, data governance, and digital rules. And it's, even when the telecom or computer services are open, we see bottlenecks, again, in transport, retail distribution, courier services, logistics, and then again, incompatible rules like data protection, cybersecurity, online consumer protection, platform responsibilities, and others. So as we see, there is significant opportunity for countries in the region to bring about greater competition in many of these areas, and with that to promote greater trade integration. Here already doing a number of operations in different countries to tackle some of the issues that I mentioned, but I definitely think that we need to make more, we should make more, and we have the right instruments be absolutely critical in driving competition. Just a quick word to say that we also now have our regional programs that are tackling some of these issues. America en el Centro, bringing greater trade cost reduction in Central America, or in Conexión Sur, we are working to promote regulatory convergence on a number of these topics. So let me stop here, but I see great potential, and I really want to thank the editors, the authors, you and everyone, Ana Maria as well, for a report that I hope will be very, very impactful in the region.
Thank you very much again for those kind words. I was very lucky to inherit this project, so I do want to revert it back to all the authors. But the hope is that not only by creating the data, providing the evidence, mentioning some of the challenges, but also having positive examples. I do hope that there is demonstration effect by firms, by policymakers, and also by people demanding change when that this competition and can have, and so allows us to go through those initial hurdles that we all know are very real. We do have a big homework, I guess, in our future. The bank has the tools, and now we have a book which gives us a roadmap. I do recommend you to read it. It's a page turner. You're gonna see once you take it, you won't be able to put it down, and the data and evidence is addictive. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. And again, a big applause to the authors. Thank you very much, and I hope that you can join us for later. Thanks.